What was the response of Biden's administration to the anti-Semitic riots on campuses in the aftermath of October 7th? They created a task force for combating Islamophobia. So that's their frame of mind. But that's the Obama frame of mind for international politics, right? The way to deal with Iran is not to aggravate them. And this is, all these postmodernists and students of Edward Said, which Obama is clearly one. In my mind, Obama is the first Edward Saidian president that America ever had. Then the problem with all these wild ideologies, it's our fault. It's a narcissistic, self-centered conception of the world where everything wrong with the third world is somehow our fault because of colonialism. And it doesn't matter that the same thing holds where colonialism never touched the ground. So everything is geared towards pacification, appeasement, as opposed to deterrence. And this is, if you look at Obama's personal history, this is a South Chicago social organizer in which the mentality is that if there is some thug in the neighborhood, then you hug him. Because if you give him love, if you give him a share, a stake in society, then it will be fine. But this is not social work. And we are not taking them seriously. And they are taking themselves very seriously. When Yahya Sinwar says that he wants to eat the livers of Jews, he means this. It is not a figure of speech. And what we saw, the horrors that we saw on October 7, I spoke on my podcast to some astute student of the Muslim Brotherhood who worked in the Israeli government in some capacity. And he said, nothing about October 7 is surprising. If you had read the Hadith and the Quran seriously, and if you would understand what the theology of Hassan al-Banna was, you would understand why these terrorists took a child and cut off his right hand and an opposite leg, because this is what they learned that the Prophet did. And they were repeating a holy ceremony in what looks to Westerns as a chaotic, wallowing in sadistic evil, which it is, of course, but this is more structured than we think. And if we start taking them seriously, we would understand the threats. So that when Iran says that it will erase Israel off the map of the world, it means that when it has a nuclear weapon, it would use it. It means literally what it says. When they say that America is the devil, they mean it. When they burn an American flag, they mean it. When they burn Israeli children, they mean it. They would burn all of us if we can. So when you see in the Israeli press too, yes, context, right? There's context. This is what happens after 60 years of occupation. Never mind that Gaza was not occupied. Gaza was the pilot for a Palestinian state. If there is a Palestinian state, this would be the Palestinian state. Hamas, the majority in Judea and Samaria support Hamas, and worse, the Palestinian Authority rejoiced in October 7th. And what we don't talk about here, there were offshoots of the Fatah inside the invasion of October 7th. There is the idea that
Fatah is the Palestinian Authority.
Fatah is the Palestinian Authority, and the idea that we can think of them as separate entities. These are the radicals, and we will bring in the moderates. It's a difference of style, not of content.
Explain who these characters are, who are, we know the leadership has vastly changed in Hamas, but Mahmoud Abbas has been there for 20 years? He was elected to a 4-year term, and he's remained because Hamas would win if
he steps down.
Right.
Certainly. So the fantasy born out of the peace process is that the Palestinian national movement has matured and that it has become realistic. They see that we are not going away, so they have to reach some compromise with us. That is not the way the Palestinian Authority sees it. The Palestinian Authority is a terrorist organization. For our own convenience in the West, we invented a moderate faction. But the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, what is called the West Bank, they brag about killing more Jews than Hamas in Judea and Samaria. So that there is now a report, of course the mainstream press would not touch it, called Policemen by Day, Terrorists by Night. These people who are in the security apparatus of the Palestinian Authority are moonlighting as terrorists, and many of them reach Israeli jails. As you know, there is a pay-for-slay program in which you get a monthly stipend or a monthly salary in proportion to the extent of damage you cause to Jews, measured in the length of your sentence in an Israeli jail. So if you get a life sentence, which is you get the highest salary as long as you are serving in jail. So
and since that person is in jail supposedly for life, of course that doesn't happen because they have to be traded for hostages. But who gets that money? Their family?
Yeah. It's a way of making a living. The Palestinian Authority incentivizes terror. If someone dies in an act of terror while killing Jews, their family get a lifetime stipend. And secondly, the people who work or in the payroll of the Palestinian Authority also moonlight as terrorists, and many of them are in Israeli jails. So, and now the crucial thing to know about our peacenik army, our peacenik brass, is that when they and Shabak report a terrorist attack, they mention the organizational affiliation of the terrorist, unless it's the Palestinian Authority, in which case they do not mention it. And they've been called out on this many times. And they are also, or some of the brass, are also implicated in the fake news campaign about settler violence. I'm not saying there is no settler violence. The settler violence is in no proportion to the Palestinian violence, and some of these people feel they are not protected by the IDF, so they can be quicker on the trigger. I don't want to defend anyone taking the law into their own hands, but the exaggeration in the press of the settler violence, along with the denial of the violence of the Palestinian Authority, is designed to do what? These are two elements in two sides of the same equation. They are meant to sell to the Israeli public the fantasy that there is still a partner for peace, and that the problem in Judea and Samaria are the settlers, not the Palestinians. This is a lie. If you look at the campaign for the settlers' violence, some of it is financed by European money given to Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence are a bunch of liars, and their method is designed to be immune to fact-checking because they publish anonymous testimonies, and they've been caught lying many times. Now, so look what they're doing. This most extreme anti-Israeli propagandist organization is getting European money in order to bring evidence of settler violence. And what they do is, if Arab herdsmen steal cattle from Jews, then when the Jews take it back, it's reported as settler violence against the Arabs. That's their modus operandi.
This was in the news that the Palestinian Authority would no longer participate in pay-for-slay. And then some reporting came out that something had happened in which I gather the Palestinian Authority set up a foundation that would pay instead of the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority would fund the foundation. Something like that. So do you know about that? Like what was that?
It's a fraud. Abbas is on record for saying that if they are out of every single penny of their budget, but still have money for the pay-for-slay, he doesn't call it that. It's the salaries of the shaheeds, the martyrs. Then they will spend their last penny on this, because again, we don't take them seriously. Who are the heroes of the Palestinian national movement? Only terrorists. Only people who kill Jews. If you go to Judea and Samaria, who do they name a square after, a school after? Who do they put the statue of? Who are the heroes of their children's story? Only martyrs who kill Jews. This is the idea that we can see the Palestinian national movement in the way, through the image of ourselves, in the way we perceive our own national movements, and so believe that their aim, like ours, is political independence, is completely wrong. Their whole set of terms is wrong. Their epistemology is different. Everything is completely different. And at the core of their national movement is the destruction of Zionism. They call it the right of return. It's not a right, and it's not even a return now, because the people who are supposed to return were never here. And UNRWA, which is the institution which perpetuates the so-called Palestinian refugee problem, because they're not refugees, many of them are citizens, have been resettled. The purpose of this is to use the idea of refugees in order to delegitimize and then destroy Zionism. The way that our immune system is broken, they've figured it out. So you have members of Knesset who supported Arafat preaching to Israelis that they are racists. And this speaks perfectly to all the human rights organizations, right? We're not really protecting human rights. They are post-colonial woke ideologues, and their view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has nothing to do with human rights. It just says that Israel is the bad side and the Palestinians are the victims. We are the colonialists and they are the indigenous people, and we have occupied and crushed them. That's the view of the conflict. And when they have a human rights organization, it doesn't care about human rights, because the idea of human rights is that they are universal. If you care about the rights of one side and not the other, then you don't support human rights, you support the rights of one side. And you can see this everywhere. Look, Haaretz, the woke newspaper in Israel, say they have a principled stance against transfer, against moving populations. Do they really? No, they are in favor of tearing out the whole Jewish population of Judea and Samaria. They have a principled stance in which the principle is that the Palestinians are right and we have no right to be here. That's their principled stance. And human rights can only be used when they are against us. This is why B'Tselem, which is probably the most prominent Israeli human rights organization, when Bassem Eid, a Palestinian who worked for B'Tselem, brought reports about violation of human rights that the Palestinian Authority commits, they said, no, we won't publish that. And they did not, because they are not motivated by human rights. They are motivated by delegitimizing Zionism. And we have the same problem with the parts of the peace movement that have turned completely post-colonial and have become our enemies. Look, it's not a pleasant thing to say, but many liberal Jews in America have become enemies of Israel. I'm not using this word in a callous way. They have become enemies of the state of Israel. Someone like J Street, who in the middle of an existential war is demanding an embargo on weapons to Israel, is an enemy. It's not, there are no two ways about it. You are trying to sabotage our war effort in which our existential interests are involved. So how should we call this? Are we supposed to be friends with these people? I think we should stop. I think we should start calling them out. The whole of the mainstream media has become an industry of demonizing the right. What people don't realize outside Israel is how terrible the rifts are here. And the left has basically been behaving, or parts of it, as if the real enemy is Netanyahu, and Hamas, if not an ally, is at least a lucky incident which will help take down Netanyahu, because we can stick this failure to him, which doesn't really make that much sense. Because on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, it's your watch and this happened, so clearly you have responsibility, which is true. But the reason this happened is because we left Gaza. Had we not left Gaza, this would never have happened, clearly. So the real mistake, and what Israelis realized on October 7, is that the whole turn that we took in the Oslo Accords, in the idea of a compromise, peace, solution to the conflict, all that was wrong. And we are getting another Hamastan now under the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria. So if you were on the Israeli left, or the Biden administration for that matter, your first thought after October 7 was, how do I rescue the two-state solution after Israelis saw who the other side is? And so what you need to do if you want to influence public opinion after that is the same thing that you do in the settlers' violence campaign. You need to blame Israel for this. So it's the occupation, and then the right is worse. The right is the big danger. Because if you want to maintain hope, and you are a peacenik on the Israeli side, then the one thing you can afford to recognize is that there's no partner for peace on the other side. So you have to construct a narrative, as they have, in which the reason we don't have peace is Israel. Once there was a very brave man named Rabin, the narrative goes, and Rabin, the old soldier, decided to take off his uniform and reach out with an olive branch to Yasser Arafat. And this was, as they called it then, the peace of the brave, Shalom shel Amitzim. And then, according to this narrative, what happened is Baruch Goldstein, in February of 94, an American-born Jewish settler walked into the tomb of the patriarchs and slaughtered, murdered, praying people from their back, 29 killed, 125 wounded, until they managed to kill him. So that brought about a reaction from the Palestinians. Remember? Escalation, miscalculation. So now came Palestinian terrorism. But that too did not, these were the enemies of peace on both sides, we were told. So now nobody asks who is the moderate. We know who the peace movement is on our side, but who are the moderates on their side? Allegedly Yasser Arafat. And then came Yigal Amir and murdered Rabin, and with 3 bullets, he killed the peace process. If you cling to that narrative, you still have hope, because it's our fault and we can mend it. It's like the Obama frame of mind. It's always us. It's never them. They are just a blank slate on which we project that we can mold.
I mean, on the one hand, it's a strength to say when problems happen, what was my role? And then you can solve them, because if you're only blaming other people, you become a victim and you can never solve anything. You're just a perpetual victim. Yep. So on the one hand, there's that strength. On the other hand, isn't it sort of a bit of a historical Jewish pathology that we are always looking at how we caused whatever damage was done to us?
Yeah, it's a consoling view in exactly the way you said it is. Because if that's the case, then we have a cure for anti-Semitism. And Jews repeatedly internalize these negative stereotypes. And then, if you look at the anti-Netanyahu movement, for them, normality is post-Jewish. And as my friend Irit Linur says, their idea of Zionism is Sweden in Hebrew. So we will get away from all these unpleasant Jews and their comfortable, warm little swamp, and step into the light of Enlightenment, modern globalism. And we will go to the same conference and be like all other peoples. And that idea is, if we stop being so awfully Jewish, then people will stop hating us. And as the joke goes, what is anti-Semitism? It is hating Jews more than is absolutely necessary. So these people are the absolutely necessary. There is an absolutely necessary hatred of the Jews, and let's finally move away from all these messianic, traditional, deplorable clingers and all the other catchphrases for those who refuse to modernize. Then this meets, I think, a mood on the left globally. I mean, in the whole West, where what you say is that self-criticism is actually a good thing. You need self-criticism if you want to improve. But then if it becomes a ritual, then self-flagellation becomes a ritual of purifying rather than actual sober criticism that allows you to improve. So you stop looking at the other you neglect their responsibility, and now you indulge in a narcissistic ritual of self-flagellation which purifies you, after which you are purified. And if you look at how this happened in academia, whole branches of academia were completely corrupted. If you look at anthropology books, I have Clifford Geertz is one of my favorites, is once they studied indigenous people, but they had a methodological introduction saying, look, we have our own biases, we don't know, we can't see them completely objectively, but we immerse ourselves in their society and imaginatively identify and understand them. And then you look at anthropology books, and the introduction just became larger and larger at the expense of the field study, and in the end you're left just with an introduction. And this is, the Edward Said mentality. We are only going to look at ourselves. What is postmodernism? It is the study of one's own text. That's what it is. So the postmodern scholar, instead of looking at the world, has turned around and is looking only at his own text and searching. Clifford Geertz called it epistemological hypochondria. So what is still wrong with my biases? But the whole turn of postmodernism is the study of disciplines. Ever since Foucault, what is Edward? I once was crazy enough to read Orientalism cover to cover in search of any assertion about the Arab world. And I think I found two. He's not interested in the Arab world at all. So when there is a statement about the Arabs, he only asks about the scholar who wrote it and his interests. He never asks, is it true? So that, as I tell students, the key to understand all postmodern writing is there is no truth. And therefore, we shouldn't ask what is true. We should only ask who decides and for what purpose. And the answer is always the same. It's like a sausage machine. Whatever you put into it, you get the same sausage. Because the answer is always the hegemonic group in order to perpetuate its own superiority or its own mastery of the other or of the margin. So you have the same question, the same answer, no matter where you go. And my late mother used to say that postmodernism will die of boredom because it's just mind-numbing. You sit in these classes. I remember being a PhD student and you're studying. There's a class on the Cold War, and we're examining phallic metaphors in Kennedy's Cold War speeches. And there was almost a nuclear war in Cuba. Is that what's interesting now? And you just sit there. I ended up quitting class and doing only independent studies. They're also extremely domineering in their ideology. So if you argue in class, they give you hell. I had one teacher walk out in the middle of my speaking in his class. He just collected his stuff and walked out without saying anything. And I'll say for the department that he got reprimanded. I guess I was outspoken. I'm an Israeli, but my criticism of the piece that we read, I had an argument. But there are arguments you're not allowed to voice, even if other people around you also think so, and they do. It's just you can't say the truth.
You're making me think about a problem with the postmodern lens. And one of the problems is that it doesn't see itself as a lens. And so your professor couldn't hear whatever you were saying because you were coming from a different perspective, not using the postmodern lens. And it is it's like gibberish. There's the one thing about paradigms is that when you're in one, you can't tell. You can't see what it is. You can see other people's paradigms, but you can't see your own. You think you are just seeing things the way they are. And the postmodern lens is a way of kind of fooling people into thinking that they are seeing things the way they are, rather than, some other kind of disciplinary lens where you're using a lens.
Isn't it ironic? Because they are the ones who are insisting that you can't see anything outside your lens. But the way they conceive themselves is, since they know that, we can trust them. After that, we can trust them. And you see, my PhD was part of it was about Richard Rorty, and wrought unimaginable damage to Western academia because he translated French postmodernism into American liberalism, convincing Americans that if you are a relativist and you have no foundational values, then you are more tolerant. And this is clearly not the same. If you don't have an argument against the Nazis because everything is relative, then you are not more liberal and more tolerant. Then you are leaving all arbitration of ideas to power. And that's it. And this is exactly the illusion. The illusion is that if you think that all values are created equal, then you are more democratic. And this, the whole postmodern academia rides on that wave, and it ends up what? It ends up defending Islamofascists. And when I say that we have lost our immune system, is that in that junction exactly, in which you embrace those who would destroy you. And those who would destroy you, if you touch them, they scream, racism, right? Ilhan Omar, the supporter of Hamas, is so sensitive to racism. And so when I say that the woke and the post-colonial don't believe in human rights, they're also not against racism. They're only against racism when it's employed by the group they call hegemonic. They are ardent supporters and defenders of Arab racism against Jews. And you're not allowed to criticize Arabs because that is Islamophobia. So look at this, they're not against racism. They are supporters of affirmative action racism. So the racism of the downtrodden is to be commended. It was most clear in the aftermath of October 7th with American radical feminism, in which the very people, as Batya Unger-Sargon has pointed out, the very people who said, believe her, whatever she said, you don't need evidence. If she felt this way, then this is the truth. These people, as she said, turned on a dime, and now the rape of Israeli women, and I'm not going to mention the horrors of this sexual sadism here, that is suddenly, oh, this may be armed resistance. Well, we're not sure it's sexual violence, and we need more evidence. And there is a context to this. So Judith Butler, the oracle of queer theory and postmodern feminism, suddenly took a step back and wondered, do we really know that Hamas did anything that is not legitimate armed resistance? Because after all, they are the victims in this struggle.
Yeah, but actually what she said was that it wasn't anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that too. Anti-Semitism is a trap for her, right? Because in that worldview, it's in a sense, its grid is amoral. It only understands strong and weak. And if you're weak, then no matter what you do, you can burn a baby. But if the baby is Jewish and is part of the oppressor class, then that baby being burnt by a Palestinian terrorist is the baby's fault. It's the baby's fault. The baby is the problem here. And this is how they look. This is the whole lens through which, look, this seeps into, it's not just Judith Butler, who arguably is on the far, far postmodern end.
Well, but let me just say something about Judith Butler. She, at one point, said that she was uncomfortable with what happened on October 7th. And
uncomfortable.
Yeah. Right.
So was I.
Right. But I mean, just a glimpse of her humanity, that she wasn't happy about it, that she didn't like what happened. And her acolytes turned on her for saying that.
Yeah, for being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because she's trying to sell this view, and she needs to maneuver in such a way that people who have seen the horrors will still relate to her, and she would not be like completely crazy. But Judith Butler, the simple key for understanding all this is superficial. And I think what we don't understand about postmodernism, and that's maybe for another conversation, So we keep thinking about it as cultural Marxism, but we don't see the American element of radical individualism in this. Because if you read Judith Butler, in the end, all gender trouble, in the end, it's not that far from Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Right.
It's not that far from John Wayne, because what was the self-made man is now the self-made transgendered individual. That's what it is. But Judith Butler is on the radical end. But look at the Biden administration and look at Kamala Harris. They have been telling us that Israel has also committed atrocities, right? They were playing into the court at The Hague. Violence should stop because there are victims on both sides, and Israel is committing war crimes. They kept hinting that there are war crimes. So they assigned the Palestinian deaths to Israeli responsibility, while the Palestinians were putting civilians in harm's way as human shields. And
human
according
sacrifices, really.
But in international law, if you use human shields, you are responsible for their deaths. So all this media campaign in which you see dead Palestinian babies, that a really moral person should look at that and say, that blood is on the hands of Hamas. And indeed, Yahya Sinwar used to say this, our women and children are the dam which will stop the decline of the Palestinian people. So their bodies would be sacrificed to the cause, and it's a holy cause, and there will be martyrs. But we in the West, and the whole media is like that. You see a picture of a dead baby and an IDF soldier, and you're supposed to connect them. Now look at the New York Times, because the New York Times now published that there are dead children with bullets that we know come from Israeli rifles. And if you just looked at the bragging of the Hamasniks when they return Israeli hostages, they have Israeli weapons. It could have come from their guns. And we know that they shot their own civilians if they dared escape from combat areas. There is no army in the world, and there is no campaign in history in which any army took such caution not to hurt civilians as collateral damage. There is a report, a joint Israeli-American report, in which this is the most densely populated area and the hardest for urban warfare. And we have managed to keep the ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths below 3. The assessment is 1.5 to 3. If you take the international average, it's 7 to 9 civilians per combatant casualty. So we have not just been extra careful, we have been uniquely successful in the face of an enemy who is trying to maximize their own deaths as a means of propaganda against us. So this whole righteous reprimand of Israel and the demonization of Israel in the international media is an outrage. And we have been told at every stage of this war that if you just go in there, there would be horrendous civilian casualties, notably Rafah. You remember that Kamala Harris said she studied the map and there is no way to take out this population. Well, we did. We moved 1 million people out of harm's way, and we'll keep doing that. You know, it's my opinion that nobody should have returned to the north of the Gaza Strip, and we should have annexed that part and settled it with Jews. Because we keep thinking in Western terms, for that side, death is not an issue. These are all martyrs, they're going to heaven. Destruction of buildings is certainly not an issue. Aid money would come and there would be plentiful employment in the construction business in Gaza. And the one price that theologically, if you take their theology serious, that their theologians say this trumps jihad. You should stop jihad if that's the price. And they talk about land. Yeah. So if we take away land, this war would register in their memory, not as Yahya Sinwar being the new Saladin, but as a war that should not have been started because the price was too high. And we should exact a price that's too high. In the West, we keep talking about proportional. Deterrence is disproportionality. If you lay one slap on your wife, you are going to 4 years in jail. Is that proportional? Well, if you ask me if I prefer a slap or 4 years in jail, I prefer a slap. Deterrence is achieved by disproportional punishment. And this is, we should exact a price as to make clear for all the bigger sharks in this area, not the Hamas, which is the weakest of our enemies. They should understand that if you hurt us, you will pay a price too steep that you do not want to pay.
Well, let's be clear that the conversation about proportionality in war is not about this kind of thing. Proportionality is about not using force that's excessive to what your goals are. So, if it's
that's not how it's phrased in the liberal press here,
no,
because they say,
not.
look, how many Israelis were killed?
Right.
1,400. And 600 more soldiers, say 2,000. How many Palestinians were killed? They take the numbers from Hamas, so it probably is.
Yeah, you're right. So in the sort of vernacular, proportionality is used sort of that way.
Yeah.
The way that you're using it is appropriate to that conversation, and that's an interesting way to think about what price is high enough that it is a deterrent. In the